The entire time I knew him, he only ever had one goal. To wipe out half the universe. If he gets all the Infinity Stones, he can do it with the snap of his fingers.
Why does a supervillain want to kill off half the population of the universe? The answer, and what we think about it, next on GrowthBusters.
Calling. Call a GrowthBuster. Whoa.
Welcome to the GrowthBusters Podcast. Here we discuss our society's addiction to growth, and we share with you the journey to sustainability. Well, how do we get there when we're starting with a full planet? Too many people consuming too much stuff and expelling too much waste. Well, we've got news about that, and some of it can be pretty joyful. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth. Be sure to visit growthbusters.org for show notes and for more about this journey. Well, with me in the basement studio, as usual, is Dana Hickey.
Hi there.
Dana is considerably younger than me. She's a college student and actively involved in more than one student sustainability organization at Georgia Tech. So I'm really glad to have your perspective at the table.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, trying to help.
Before we get to the main topic, I want to do a couple things. And first is I want to share a little bit of listener feedback. We really love to hear what you think about the podcast and what you think about the issues that we discuss. So you're always welcome to provide that feedback. You can send an email to podcast@growthbusters.org. You can comment on the GrowthBusters Podcast Facebook page. You can tweet us or reply to tweets from GrowthBusters on Twitter as well. And I guess, is there a way on Instagram for people to give us feedback?
Yeah, they can direct message us or just comment on one of our pictures.
And what's the name of that Instagram account? GrowthBusters Podcast?
Yeah. That's what I thought it was, but I wasn't positive and didn't want to say the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. So if you're not already following GrowthBusters Podcast on Instagram, we'd love to see you there. The first email we got from listeners in response to our podcast about the movie Downsizing. Dear Dave, I finally got around to listening to your podcast about the movie where they learned how to reduce human size and therefore human impact on the environment. Numerous nations, of course, currently show that you can have both a high quality of life and far less environmental damage than we experience in the U.S. I was struck with how quickly the anti-straw message has been spread, calling for straws not made of plastic. How much better to teach people that they can put their lips on the edge of a glass and consume liquids without using a straw. I think the current demand for straws comes from paranoia about germs and thinking a straw is more sanitary. How I wish the message about the limits to growth, the need to reduce our human population, and other more meaningful changes that society needs to make, rather than that we need to eliminate plastic straws, could determine our future. And this is from Dawn in Colorado.
I like the little comment she had about people putting their lips actually on the glass, because it's not that much different than using a straw. It's about the same, and it's like they're washing the dishes afterwards anyway, and they've washed it beforehand, so you're perfectly fine drinking from that glass.
Yeah, and I never thought about the sanitary thing. I kind of like to sip a soda through a straw or a milkshake through a straw. I think it's just more fun, more interesting.
Yeah.
But you know what? Dana and I went to lunch today at a restaurant, and I forgot to take reusable straws with us. And so I had to suffer through lunch without a straw. It was terrible.
Yeah, so pitiful, I mean.
Earlier on my journey, I would have just gotten a straw because I loved it. But now I've turned over a new leaf, largely because of that conversation we had in the last podcast. Mm-hmm. So that was episode 14, if you haven't already heard about plastic straws and reusable straws and the movie Downsizing. One more email to share. I am downsized. The state tax people question how I can survive with the income I report on my yearly income tax, which is below the poverty level, and I just say I do not buy what I want, but I buy what I need. No toys, just survival. Unfortunately, as the population increases, so does the cost of necessities, as well as the damage to this planet. Well, we can always move to Mars or some other celestial object and continue making babies and continue this insanity. God said we should do this. I wish there was a way your efforts could get to a media that has exposure to which people could get access. What does a donation do? There must be a way. I care. Many people care, but the word must be heard around the world. How? Not through our leaders or our churches. How can your ideas make change? From a concerned couple who wish to remain anonymous. Now, I found myself as I read that first paragraph about living below the poverty level, and I thought maybe they were going to offer that they're still living a really good life and a joyful life, and they didn't offer that, and maybe they don't see it that way. But I do. I kind of adopted a lifestyle as a starving artist and gave up a really good income producing films for Fortune 500 companies, and I gave all that up and had to really skinny up my life in order to be able to afford to produce the GrowthBusters documentary, and in order to continue this growth busting work, which pays nothing half the time and next to nothing the rest of the time. And I'm having a great time. I do not need to be making megabucks or spending megabucks to have a fun life.
Yeah, it's all in your mindset of what you want out of life. It's like things or the experiences. So
good point. Or just love, friendship.
That too.
Yeah, things like that. We're glad we're getting listener feedback, and I want to encourage you to write to us, and I think you'll probably have something to say after you listen to the conversation today about a newer movie. So we invite your feedback. You can send an email to podcast@growthbusters.org, or you can post a comment at the GrowthBusters Podcast page on Facebook, or
you can message us on Instagram or Twitter.
That's right. And what's our Instagram account?
GrowthBusters Podcast.
Great. And one of our writers asked, what can we do? How can we spread the word further? And one of the things you can do is follow us on Instagram, follow us and like us on Facebook. Help us to gather some momentum and get more attention, be discovered by more people. And that can include even directly recommending the podcast or the movie or the website or the Facebook pages to your friends, to your progeny, to your associates at the office. Most podcast listeners learn about a podcast that they eventually love by word of mouth. Some friend tells them about this great podcast. So we're counting on you to do that. That's one of the things we need you to do, in addition to or instead of sending a donation. Donations were mentioned, and I do want to mention that this is a non-profit project, and the fuel we run on is donations from our supporters. So head over to growthbusters.org and click on the donate button and become a regular supporter if you can afford to do that, or a one-time supporter if you're just inspired today when you finish listening to this podcast. Okay, one last thing. I just noticed this piece in the news last week. It was an Associated Press story by Morgan Lee, and the headline was, New Mexico population growth trails other Western states. And based on my long experience observing pro-growth bias in the media, I knew I wasn't going to like the story. And sure enough, there were some myths perpetuated in here. The story starts off right off the bat. New Mexico's population has grown at the slowest rate in the western U.S. during the past decade. From mid-2007 through mid-2017, New Mexico's annual population growth rate was about 0.5%, while population growth in Colorado, Texas, and Utah was at least 3 times as fast. I really hate to see it when a state or a city compares its population growth rate to that of others, and they're in this competition, evaluating their success based on how fast they're growing, and they want to be growing as fast as the others or faster than the others. And in a world where we really need to be living sustainably, a growing population can't be a metric for success, Dana.
Yeah, they're still growing to some extent, right? It's like 0.5%. So they're still growing. It's just at a slower rate, which is not a bad thing. You can't have growth all the time or you wouldn't be able to be sustainable. New Mexico might not have been able to sustain their society that they had before. So it'd be interesting to look at the environmental standpoints of how well they're supporting the population that they currently have and if it's even a good standard. So.
Yeah, we know that we are in overshoot and the world is overpopulated. So for anyone to have a goal to grow their population is just really irresponsible. It's archaic. It's not 21st century thinking. One of our goals here at GrowthBusters is to help policymakers realize that they are not in a competition with other cities or regions or states to have the fastest population growth. In fact, New Mexico ought to be celebrating because they are a leader. They are closer to sustainability than those other states mentioned. Those other states need to be trying to grow much more slowly, and the ultimate goal for everybody really needs to be to have population contraction. We need to be contracting our population back toward a sustainable level. So we should be celebrating slower growth and then ultimately celebrating no growth. And in fact, this is such an interesting subject. I think we're going to devote the entire GrowthBusters podcast to that subject, to cities and regions and states and nations, territories, provinces, you name it, every geopolitical entity, their quest for growth and their buying into the myth of prosperity from growth. I think we should spend a whole episode on that. Maybe we can do that next episode.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, cool. All right, now
on to the new Avengers movie that we're going to talk about. So Avengers Infinity War.
As of this recording, the movie's been out a couple of months and has already grossed worldwide over $2 billion. It's a big movie.
Yeah, so Avengers Infinity War had an interesting topic that we thought about because their villain Thanos has this goal of reducing population, and comparing him to some other villains, Justice League had a supervillain, and his goal basically was to rule the universe, and that was it. So it was interesting in my mind that Thanos had a goal that, kind of related to some ideas that we had talked about, and something we might be worried about is like population growth.
Yeah, something more real, more current, and really more complex, because it should be said that this villain, Thanos, he's concerned about overpopulation. And in fact, the planet he comes from, Titan, was devastated by overpopulation, and he tells us in the film that that's because they wouldn't listen to him when he warned them about limited resources and the need to stop procreating as fast. So
he has a really complex issue, which is it's exciting for a box office film that has this complex issue of population reduction that we've been talking about. And even though we might not agree with all of his methods because they're not that ethical, it's good to get that idea talked about in people's minds, so maybe they'll think about it.
So what are his methods in a nutshell?
Oh, he just wants to kill everyone. He wants to kill half of the whole universe.
Yeah,
so
that's his solution.
Yeah. So if you're familiar with the comics, he gets his Infinity Gauntlet, and that's how he plans to do it. And the movie definitely leaves you at a interesting ending with that goal. He thinks that reducing population by half will solve all the problems, which there was an interesting comment on one of the articles we read that he has such a complex problem, and then he thinks solving it in a really simple way will be the ultimate solution. And so someone made a comment on that because they said, it's like, this problem could have had such a great, discussion about some better ways to do it. And I think we're going to talk about that some more.
Yeah, at first I was pretty excited about it because anytime there's a popular motion picture or a song or television series or anything that really puts this subject of overshoot or overpopulation or our obsession with economic growth, any of those topics into the public eye, I think, wow, that's good, because we are busy here at GrowthBusters trying to raise awareness that these are real issues, real problems, that we're facing significant crises as a result of overshoot. So I was excited that theme was going to be addressed in the film, but I was really disappointed to discover that the person concerned about it was the villain and that his solution was really pretty darn villainous.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the whole Marvel universe, their new trend has kind of been connecting the topics to a lot of more present-day issues and having some more real, bigger questions. Because after the first Avengers movie and then connecting to the newest Spider-Man movie, Homecoming, they had the issue of what happens after you have this big environmental disaster. So they asked this type of questions. They had the whole cleanup crew, cleaning up all the alien junk and stuff. So I was hoping they would go along more of those trends to ask, these huge questions and have sort of answers go with them. But I think with this movie, they fell a little short with some of their solutions of, just killing everyone.
Yeah, and so one of the big questions I want to visit today is, okay, we've got the subject is brought up, but it is being brought up by somebody who is not a hero, who is not admirable, not noble. They have a lousy solution. And it reminds me of Inferno, the Dan Brown novel and film of the same name, that the villain in Inferno was concerned about overpopulation, and he again had an ugly solution, an inhumane solution. So it makes me wonder, wow, are these films doing us any favors, or are they really setting us back because they raise the issue, but they handcuff it to something really ugly?
Yeah. Almost to be like the devil's advocate for these movies, because I obviously agree we need to have maybe a better solution, but yeah. I really question if, Avengers was super popular and I loved it aside from the questionable population goals, but I think with a lot of these movies, they have the question when they're producing of like, what would the actual movie be if a good guy said, how are we going to solve this population? Like, what's the morality in that? I feel like they'd get so much backlash. Yeah.
Plus, it might be a snoozer, I guess.
And when I was researching all this, I was thinking, what kind of movie would this fall into? What sector or genre would it be if you had a superhero that's like, I'm going to have population control? Like, it would be so ambiguous. And I think it's the type of thing that'd be hard to market. And so they are going back to the trope of the villain having this disaster of population direction because, we are the population, so we obviously can relate and don't want that to happen.
And I just have to interject one thing. You said population control, and I want to say if a hero comes up with a solution and calls it population control, then he or she have lost me already because I don't use that word. I don't associate that word with any of the positive, humane solutions to human overpopulation. Population control has this connotation of being top-down and coercive. And, we may get to a point someday where we all have to agree to do that. Yeah. But I don't think we've completely exhausted all of the more voluntary and humane options. And so that would be what I would want the hero to come up with is not population control, but population responsibility.
I was thinking population suggestions.
And see, so that's even more of a snoozer. I've come down from the mountain with my 10 population suggestions.
Yeah, it would be interesting I'm just trying to think of what would the story be with that? If just you'd be campaigning to just the crowds of people being like, what are you doing?
Well, so apparently that is a huge challenge and it's real because we'll talk a little later about other films besides Avengers Infinity War. And it seems like no one's been able to come up with that. And maybe one idea I have is that it really is just a lack of imagination because the people who are writing these screenplays and writing these novels are not the most overpopulation literate people on the planet. We are here in the basement studio at GrowthBusters World Headquarters. We're very overpopulation literate. Can't talk, but maybe we should be writing a screenplay because we don't even need to use our imagination. We have some really good understanding of how simple the solution can be, which is, just to put in a plug for the idea, the simple solution is to move to a smaller family norm for us all to just make a lot fewer babies. Nobody needs to make us do it.
But is that a blockbuster hit of a movie?
No, the blockbuster is there's some authoritarian dictator that sterilizes everybody in their sleep or something like that. That makes more dramatic film, unfortunately.
Yeah, everyone loves the dramatics of having a villain be like, I'm going to just kill everyone off like Thanos does. So there's a suspense in that.
I found myself wondering what the screenwriters were thinking. Why did they choose this theme? Because we get that speech from Thanos about why he wants to terminate half of the beings in the universe. And he uses the word overpopulation, but that theme isn't further developed. We never see the effects of overpopulation. We never see anyone suffering.
Well, you see a little bit of, in Gamora's world, they don't show it specifically, because they have the divide and he ends up still killing off people. But he shows it a little bit there. And then you did talk about his own world. But I guess he's just making mass assumptions that every world is like that or every world will devolve into that.
I think they could have shown more if they really wanted to do something for that theme. I guess maybe I just interpreted that scene with Gamora a little differently. I thought things were ugly because he was already in the middle of killing half of the people there.
The history behind it, I think, if I'm pretty sure, is that the world was already sort of had a lot of poverty, had a lot of economic problems with it, and they didn't have many resources. And that was one reason he was attracted to the Earth. So I think it was along the lines of Earth might be coming to that too. The Gamora's world, she, I think, was living in a hut or something that was very run down. And so his solution was to adopt her and then kill her family, basically. So her world was run down and then he tried to fix it. But it's a very unclear example, I think. Yeah, they could have put better evidence of his reasoning, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I found myself thinking, okay, one of two things happened is the writers, did they just pull out of a hat? They just threw in little slips of paper with a number of different crises that Thanos could be trying to resolve. It almost felt like they just randomly chose the problem because it didn't seem like they really cared about communicating it. So that's one option. And option two would be that maybe they really think that overpopulation is overblown and that it's not a problem, and that they wanted to sort of dig a hole for it and put it in the grave. So they said, hey, why don't we have our villain be concerned about overpopulation? I mean, he's not a sympathetic character, so we can really damage the cause of population sustainability by having it taken up by the villain. What do you think? Do you think either of those happened, or do you disagree?
In the comics, he is not so much concerned with like the protecting people. That's why he's killing off all these people. Instead, he wants to impress the mistress of death, and that's why he kills millions. But
yeah. So it sounds like the screenwriters gave him a more noble purpose.
And he's been in a lot of different comics and series, so he might have some more broad ones, but that seems to be the top one.
But I get the impression you think it was still positive that this is out there and that it might have caused some interesting conversations at the bar or the soda shop after the movie. Do you think?
Yeah, I think this movie in general, I remember one of my friends before I saw it, he made an interesting comment because he said, Thanos as a villain, I can understand where he's coming from. And I was like, what? It's like, you're saying that about a villain? So even that sparked my interest because I was like, okay, what is this villain doing that's so different than every other one we've seen, where, you know, the first thing I can think of is, you know, in the Harry Potter series, Dolores Umbridge, like everyone hates her. But, you know, a lot of villains, you naturally hate them because, you know, they're doing something terrible. But you have this mixed emotions with Thanos, which is good screenwriting, I guess. But it's at least an interesting problem of like, do you agree with their ideas on the population, like that we need population reduction, or what are you agreeing with? And I didn't ask him at that point, but...
So one of my questions on my mind was whether there were people out there who thought, yeah, it's a problem, and he had a good solution. I wish we had a way to do that. And I haven't really found too much evidence that there's very many people who really think that murdering half the people on Earth or in the universe
especially since it seemed very random, considering most of the Avengers were killed. Spoiler.
Yeah. But, you know, the randomness was actually a good point because it kept it from falling into the category of euthanasia. It wasn't like he was trying to pick the dumbest people to terminate, or the smartest people, or the poorest people, or the richest people, or people of a certain race or color or something like that. Totally random, so that made it just a tiny bit more humane or ethical.
It was just so funny because him as a character, he seemed like he thought of himself so well. He's like, I am doing such a good thing for society, and even how he spoke and just his reasoning, it just made it sound like, oh, okay, this is interesting. It seemed very thought out, and then when you really dug deeper into it, you're like, okay, so you've killed half of everyone. What are you going to do now?
If you have yet to see the film, you want to go see the film, and you're going to be rooting for him to fail, hopefully. Yeah. So I was hoping we would get more responses on Facebook and Twitter in advance of recording this. I was really trying to get people to let us know what they thought about it. Did they think it hurt the cause or helped the cause? And did it spark any good conversations among them and their family or friends? And we really didn't get that much feedback in advance. So I really want to ask you, if you're listening, to kind of visit the show notes, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and watch for our questions about upcoming episodes, where we really are trying to poll you and find out what you think, because we do want to share your thoughts. So we should certainly say we would welcome follow-up communication from listeners to this, and they can weigh in with their own thoughts about where they thought Dana or Dave got it wrong today, or right.
Yeah, we'd love to hear.
I did find a few interesting comments out there. On Twitter, Ross McCardle tweeted, I thought Thanos was meant to be a baddie. Turns out his master plan is just what this planet needs. So there's one person who I think probably tongue-in-cheek is in support of that horrible solution, I guess you could say. On our Facebook page, we heard from Luis Carlos Zardo, who wrote, it was too subtle, and his motivations were also lost in the middle of a never-ending battle sequences. Also, it was simplistic. Kill half of sentient beings everywhere, and everything would be fine. Killing half of human population wouldn't solve our population problem simply because we can double the population in a few decades. I thought that was really interesting and very mathematically literate. Lewis understands the power of exponential growth and how quickly we can overpopulate once again.
It makes me think, at least now, since we're reaching our limit, which, you know, isn't a good thing, but we're becoming more aware of, like, we need to stop growth. And our society is like, okay, we're going to try to limit our we're not going to have 10 kid families. We're going to have, just to replace ourselves. But I'm wondering, if you say you did kill half of the population, would you go back to the mindset like, oh, we can still have 10 kid families? And I feel like you might even get back to the point again where a few generations later, you're at the same population cutoff that you were before. And I feel like it would just be a cycle. You're like, kill half, replace, kill half, replace.
That could happen, especially if people just weren't aware that they had been an overshoot. They wouldn't realize that as ugly as it was, things got corrected and there was the balance that Thanos was after. And let's not make the same mistake again that we made.
Like, in the movie, we know why he's doing it and the superheroes know why he's doing it. But does the rest of the world know?
Yeah, maybe
So
not.
I feel like if they didn't know, they might just continue their same trends and maybe even at a faster rate because they were worried that it could happen. So I think it's an interesting plot hole that they have in there.
Yeah. And one last comment from Lewis. He wrote, to actually cause an impact and bring conversation about the theme, we needed a decent remake of Soylent Green. And Soylent Green, that was a 1973 science fiction film starring Charlton Heston, which painted a picture of a very miserable planet Earth because of overpopulation. So in my view, at least it developed the theme more responsibly, maybe a little bit more outrageously. Although with each passing year, I think we're getting a little bit closer to that dystopian future that was painted in that film.
Yeah, I just watched that movie this weekend, and it was certainly an interesting movie because the detectives stepped over people that were just kind of like sitting in the street, and there was just excess. So the way that they positioned people, they're just picked up by huge shovels, basically, and this the use of people.
Yeah, human life was devalued. Which
was a trend in that movie, if you picked up on it later. But it was an interesting movie how they kind of developed it like that, and then how scarce resources became, that they became so dependent on Soylent Green or Soylent in general. And then just another funny side note is there's such a generational gap because I'd never heard of that movie, even though I'm into environmental stuff and I love films. But it's also interesting because there's now a Soylent drink that's made. It's like a nutritional drink. And so like when you told me about Soylent, that's what I thought of. I was like, the shake that you have at like hackathons? Like, no. You're like, no, it's a movie. So now that it would be really funny if terrible but funny Soylent was actually like a really sketchy drink. It's not, it's fine. It tastes good. But that's what I thought of.
Can we be sure?
I don't know. But literally I was like, Soylent, the drink? Nope. It's a movie with Soylent food in it, also coincidentally.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little more about Soylent Green and some other films that address this issue in a few minutes. But back to what people are saying about Avengers Infinity War. There were some interesting opinion pieces, commentary, and reviews written out there, and I'd like to share bits and pieces from a few of those. One that was really kind of fun was at Medium, and the title of the post was Maybe Thanos Was Right, and this was written by Sparky. She wrote, I was left wondering if perhaps eliminating half the human population might not be the worst idea. And I'm not saying that in a crazy person way. I'm saying that in a I want to go camping and not have to have 1,000 other people up in my business way. I really liked, so I kind of dug around a little bit and read a few things that Sparky has written, and I really like her sense of humor, and she wrote one blog post. Look in the show notes for links to get you to some of her writing. She wrote one blog post about how she had gone camping with her boyfriend, and they had gone to a developed campground where you had assigned camping spaces, and she hadn't done that in a long time, and how just appalled they were at how crowded and noisy it was. They had people walking through their campsite, and it wasn't the get back to nature experience that it was a long time ago. And well, that is one of 1,000 costs of the growth that we've been experiencing.
Well, it's interesting because another article I read talked about that, like, it might not be the best moral solution, but it is a solution. And, if you did have less population, you would have less suffering theoretically, because you have, for mankind, it'd be like less pandemics, less starvation, more access to clean water, food, less environmental degradation. Climate change might be mitigated some. So it's interesting because it would help solve some problems, but it wouldn't solve all of them, because I feel like there'd be a lot of other things that would happen from, say that did happen, that the population was reduced.
A couple other interesting comments in Sparky's piece at Medium. It's hard to be mad at human beings since the desire to reproduce is hardwired into us. I'm not sure that's true. I think that's a common assumption, but I think I see that assumption being challenged more and more. Certainly there's a lot of cultural expectation, cultural norms, cultural pressure to reproduce, and there's this expectation, but I don't know if it's really in our instinct. It would certainly be feasible that it would be as a survival instinct, but I don't know if we know that for sure it is hardwired into us.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to do more research about, see how hardwired we are to reproduce, but there's so much just culture pressure for people to, have kids, have a family. Like, that's the steps you take, especially in less developed parts of the world, because that's just something that they've done for generations. So it's great because, like, my generation isn't expected to do it as much. It's like, compared to the 1950s, it's like we can go to college, we can have jobs. We're not, like, a lot of people I know, don't necessarily want to get married. They don't necessarily want to have kids. They want to actually do things themselves. And it's just a very different mindset that, if I talk to my parents, they're like, that's not really, what it was before us. So
that's progress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it definitely is based on what you're taught and what you know. So.
Yep, good points. Another piece that I read that I really want to compliment, this was written by Deputy Science Editor Alessandra Potenza at The Verge. She really wrote one of the few intelligent analyses of this theme in the film. In her piece, which was titled, Thanos' plan in Avengers Infinity War has historical precedent, but he applies it wrong. And in this piece, Alessandra doesn't dismiss concerns about resource limits and overpopulation like a number of pieces did, and we'll get to those. She doesn't rip Paul Ehrlich or even Thomas Malthus a new one. She really says some intelligent things. It's a really good read, and I'll put a link in the show notes. I can't say enough good things about what she's done. A couple of quick comments that I want to quote from her piece. Thanos isn't the first to concern himself with overpopulation and the depletion of resources. It's just that the way he goes about fixing the universe's problems is obviously wrong. Well put, well put. And then another comment. While Thanos' plan is absurd and pure evil, movies like Avengers Infinity War can start conversations and make viewers think about these real issues that don't touch superheroes, but do have significant effects on us poor mortals.
Yeah, I like how she talks about that these movies are bringing up issues that relate to us, because, we talk about that a lot. And it's interesting because these are such mainstream movies, and that they're talking about ideas that might not be like such things, because having worries about population is not a new idea, because Malthusianism was talked about a lot in these articles, and it's the idea that if the population grows too fast, the ability to produce food, like, we won't have the ability to produce food, and it'll lead to famine. So this is a really old idea about 1800s, but not a ton of people know about it because it's not discussed a lot except in certain sects. So the fact that these mainstream media is bringing the ideas up, even if they might be talking about it in a jokingly way of killing half of the universe, they're still bringing them up, that these older ideas. So I love that she brought that up in her article and discussed it. That's
cool. It certainly caused you to do some reading and research that you wouldn't have done if this movie hadn't been out there. Malthusianism, that's a reference to Thomas Malthus. Most of the time when someone's writing about human population and they bring up Malthus, it's because they're trying to discredit sustainable population advocacy, because it's pretty easy to kind of pick at some of the things that Thomas Malthus said and thought and some of the results of his work, and yet by and large the bulk of his thinking and his writing was really pretty spot on, and he really started some important analysis, some reflection.
Because when I originally learned about it a few years ago, I learned about it in relation to being technocentric, because he was very ecocentric, and he thought that, our environment had limitations and we wouldn't ever be able to change it. Yeah. And since he wrote this, we obviously had been able to expand our carrying capacity to some extent. So we've had some technological advancements. So it's interesting because he didn't have that viewpoint. And it's like, that's the realm that it's known in. That's like, he's not technocentric, and that's how it's usually disputed. But there, even with technocentric ideals, it's like, we're still going to have some technology that might not be able to combat.
If someone was fully knowledgeable of Thomas Malthus and everything he wrote and did, they wouldn't use Malthusian in a derogatory way. It wouldn't be considered an insult. And the same thing with Paul Ehrlich. Like a number of these pieces really tore into Paul Ehrlich, the famous Stanford biologist who wrote The Population Bomb, co-wrote it with his wife Anne back in 1968, made a number of predictions that didn't end up happening on the timeline they put in the book. I think they're happening in slow motion, and they're all probably going to come to pass. But he's judged on the fact that he put some dates on those.
I think both of those, when they put it exact, like this is when it's going to happen, that's when they're just like, oh no, you're so wrong. But because we have things like technology they couldn't have foreseen, we've pushed it back. But that doesn't mean it's still not going to happen, or it's still not, possible. So they still should be considered when sometimes they're just like poo-pooed and like, no.
It's just one more example of the oversimplification that goes on, especially in this issue. All right, next what I want to do is share 4 pieces that I think were really counterproductive responses to the movie Avengers: Infinity War, and then just a few comments from some of them. First of all, from Rethinking Overpopulation through Avengers: Infinity War, this piece was in Chapman University's student-run newspaper, The Panther. So this was written by a sophomore political science major, Daniel Espiritu. I'm probably not pronouncing that exactly right. And I don't want to pick on you, Daniel. I am really glad that you wrote this, but I do want to take exception to a couple of the things you wrote. Here are a couple of things he wrote. If the population were cut in half, there would be fewer mouths to feed, but there would also be fewer hands to feed them. One person can only eat so much food, but that one person can also produce enough food for large amounts of people.
I think he's ignoring the fact that, like, one person doesn't produce our food most of the time. It's like technology that, like, you have one farmer that has a whole farm. So I don't think he's counting that in. So that's a
But I guess he
red
thinks
flag.
But he thinks if we have the farmer, the results of his efforts can feed, hundreds of people potentially. But there's an awful lot of other inputs that go into that. And also, well, there's still just the very fact that you have finite resources and you can only have so many producers. And that farmer that produces food for many, many people, it's not his labor or her labor as much as it is the fertilizer, the water, the pesticides, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the seeds, the sun's rays, helping the crops grow, so much else, the fertile soil and the organisms in the soil. There's an awful lot of inputs that go into there. It's not that human being.
Yeah, we're past the time when you have to have, 20 people like sowing the land and planting the seeds and everything when it's now.
Yeah, so that really means we need
so
fewer people,
he's wrong,
not more.
and not wrong. We are questioning him on 2 fronts, not only the resources, but also the actual manpower that he's saying needs to go into this.
True. Continuing that theme, he wrote, "The Earth's carrying capacity is not fixed because it depends on how we interact with our resources. This is how we have survived the population boom of the last few centuries." True enough. And then lastly, quoting, "Advanced countries consume resources at rates astronomically higher than what is recommended for sustainability. The average Australian requires 9.3 global hectares, a measurement unit for the ecological footprint, to sustain their lifestyle. The average person in the U.S. requires 8.2. To achieve sustainability, that number needs to be reduced to 1.7 across the globe." Now, pretty accurate, pretty knowledgeable. I'm really glad, Daniel, that you shared that with us. But I just want to ask you the question then, okay, how does that really shore up your point that that we don't need to do anything about overpopulation? How many people do you think we can successfully convince in the U.S. and Australia to cut their lifestyle down to a quarter of what it is today? Now, granted, it should be. That's exactly what we should all be doing. And that's one of the things we talk about and we try to help with in this journey to sustainability on the GrowthBusters podcast. But I don't know, Dana, do you think that's realistic to expect that we can or will be willing to live that much more simply?
I don't think it's realistic to get the large enough majority of the population to reduce in the way he's saying, because yes, ideally we want that to happen, but I feel like a lot of people's mindset and the way we're going, especially in the United States, the idea is we have the money to buy all the goods, because all the standards of how many hectares we need is based on how many goods we buy, basically. Basically, the standard that, everyone in the United States is living at, or the Australian standard, it would be hard to make people limit it to a big extent like that to such a smaller, like
1.7 global hectares.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so far we haven't demonstrated a willingness to do that, while we have demonstrated a willingness to have smaller families because the fertility rates have been dropping, but consumption rates haven't. And just to fill people in who might not be completely up on this, 1.7 global hectares, if that is your footprint, that means you are living a very, very modest lifestyle, and none of the overdeveloped world is anywhere close to that. So if you think you could be maybe content to live, say, a modest European lifestyle, that's well above 1.7. So I think while that would be fair, if we insist on continuing to overpopulate the planet, then that's what we all need to do in order to live sustainably. I think that might be more realistic to envision a world where maybe we cut our footprint to 5 global hectares or 4, but we also cut our family size and we let our population contract to a smaller level to where we do achieve a sustainable balance between how much we consume and how many of us are doing the consuming.
Yeah, I think the balance is key between the two. It's like you can't just have one extreme.
Okay, next piece, not going to be nearly as nice. Economist Lyman Stone was interviewed about this subject by Vice, the politically incorrect online magazine, in I Asked an Expert If Thanos is Right. Now, Lyman Stone, yes, he's an economist. He's a very conservative economist who works for conservative and ultra-Christian organizations, think tanks, and the like. And in fact, Lyman Stone wrote a piece that was published by Vox last November with the headline, "The U.S. Needs More Babies, More Immigrants, and More Integration." So I think when Harry Cheadle, the Vice West Coast editor who chose to interview Lyman Stone for this recent piece, obviously he knew what kind of answer he was going to get from Lyman Stone when he asked if Thanos is right. So I'm less than impressed. Certainly this choice wasn't intended to get some objective analysis. Apparently Harry Cheadle had a preconceived notion that Thanos wasn't right, that there was a problem, and so he sought out an economist who was going to tell us that. And Dana, I don't know if you've figured this out yet, but if you haven't, you will soon make note of it, that if you ask an economist about limits to growth,
economy? What?
or about overpopulation, usually you're not going to get an answer that reflects any serious enlightenment about limits to growth. You're going to get something about how we need another farmer because he can feed 20 people. We need more people on the planet because only so many of them are going to be Albert Einstein, and we need more Einsteins. Those are the kinds of answers you get from economists. So what did Lyman Stone say? What about a more mild form of Thanosism, where he snaps his fingers and implements a universal one-child policy? Would we be thanking him? Well, if it was a one-child policy that was just a recommended one-child, if it was a one-child norm, I would be thanking him. But of course, I think Lyman Stone is trying to connect concern about overpopulation with China's infamous one-child policy, which was implemented horribly. There were horrible human rights abuses, and it was not a good solution. But just because there has been a bad solution in history doesn't mean that we don't have a problem and that we need to be finding good solutions to.
Well, yeah, I feel like whenever you force someone to do something, it doesn't end well.
Yeah. Lyman Stone tells Vice that we have enough agricultural output to feed the world. Of course, we do only because we are using huge amounts of fossil fuel input, and we're creating ocean dead zones, and we're destabilizing the climate in order to have that amount of agricultural output. So that's not sustainable. He also tells Vice that water isn't a problem because it's renewable, and we can always desalinate. But he does wisely point out that we need a lot of energy to desalinate water. And he says that thankfully there is more than enough solar energy falling on the earth. There's more than enough wind, hydro, biomass. But he thinks people are worried about overpopulation today just because of climate change. And so here's what he says in the interview. The mid-level education, cocktail party level of information, activists have it in their heads that the family with 4 kids down the street is causing global warming. That's just total crap. What's causing global warming is that your local power plant is coal-fired instead of natural gas-fired, or natural gas-fired instead of a hydro plant, or it's a hydro plant instead of wind and solar. Well, I don't know where he gets that, because the average family with 4 kids down the street if that's mom and dad and 4 kids, that's 6 carbon emitters. Instead of, if that family down the street had 2 kids, it would be 4 carbon emitters, or 1 kid, it would be 3 carbon emitters. And Lyman Stone doesn't acknowledge that the number of power plants running, that number is a response to the number of people and how much consuming they're doing.
The first question they ask is, let's start off simple. Are there too many people in the world? And he just says no.
Well, ask an economist. There are a few economists where you'll get a little bit more enlightened answer, but okay, and then next, in Thanos, the villain in Infinity War is just another environmentalist worried about overpopulation. This was published by Reason magazine, and was written by a research assistant at humanprogress.org. So again, kind of consider the source. It's not too big a surprise. Human Progress is a project of the Cato Institute. That's a conservative think tank. So what Alexander Hammond had to say that I thought was worth sharing, I'm not going to say worth sharing, what I wanted to share that he wrote was that missing from the conversation about resource depletion is one crucial consideration: human ingenuity. That's that theme again that the economists always come up with, is that we need more people because they're going to innovate our way out of all these problems of resource limitations. I don't think you have a lot of faith in that. No,
sorry. Yeah, for people who cannot see my face, I'm just kind of like, just very sad at that comment. Yeah. I'm just thinking, that's so technocentric. You can't do that forever.
The last one I want to share that was a little bit unimpressive was at thestranger.com, which I think is a pretty good publication because that's an alternative news weekly in Seattle. And there are some good and some bad in this piece, I think. I can't say word for word what the headline was, so I'm just going to abbreviate a little bit. An effing liberal is the villain of Avengers Infinity War. And this was written by Charles Moodid, hope I'm pronouncing that right, who is a filmmaker, but he writes about film, books, and music for The Stranger. So this was really kind of a movie review, movie report. What he wrote was, part of Thanos' villainy can be traced back to the way liberals have formulated the environmental crisis. From this point, we see the bad Malthusian reasoning of overpopulation. It blames people, but not the way people live. So his whole point is that it's not a matter of that there's too many people. The problem is that we have capitalism and we have this economy that calls for us to be ever consuming more and more. And he's half right. That is a big part of the problem. That's a huge part of the problem. But that doesn't mean that the number of people participating in that system or any other system that isn't a part of the equation that we need to get into balance in order to live sustainably.
Yeah, because even if you had all of the population that's huge living with a smaller footprint, they'd still collectively have huge impact. So you need to have a smaller population with a small footprint. That would be key. But
yeah. He went on to write, if you put all this together, you will see why the villain in Infinity War is coded as a liberal. But imagine if Thanos simply said to the large living things of the universe, you must change your ways. Stop eating meat. Stop burning the fossils of ancient life. Start recycling everything. Start using public transportation. This wouldn't be an irrational demand or as dramatic as killing trillions upon trillions. It's not asking a species to change, but asking it to change its behavior. So, interesting points there, and like I said, just half right. The fact that we have this growth-oriented system, this economy that demands more and more consumption, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing we need to be working on, especially when you're this deep into overshoot. We've got to be working on both. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you made a good point. If we have everyone living more modestly, but we have huge numbers of people, do the math.
It's still a lot.
Yeah. And the more people we have, the more modestly we have to live if we're going to live sustainably. And why do we need to live sustainably? Well, it's because we don't get to live if we don't. Ultimately, long term, we will become extinct if we don't get that equation down somehow.
Yep.
There was another piece called The Real Villain in Avengers Infinity War is Overpopulation Panic. This was published in The Federalist, written by G. Shane Morris, a senior writer at Breakpoint, which is a program of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. He's also written for Summit Ministries and the Christian Post. A couple of quotes I want to share with you from his piece. And he takes advantage of this film to try to chew up Paul Ehrlich, the Stanford biologist, and spit him out. Not only did hundreds of millions not starve in the years following Ehrlich's prognostication, but thanks to a green revolution, worldwide food production tripled while population more than doubled. Global absolute poverty fell to its lowest level on record. The average human life expectancy climbed to its highest level ever, and India and England went right on existing. Now, what's missing is the next paragraph. And at the same time, we destabilized the climate by pumping excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We created dozens and dozens and dozens of ocean dead zones. We pushed our fisheries almost into complete collapse. We began the 6th mass extinction of species on the planet. Forgot those things.
Yeah, missing a little bit.
Just a little bit. He also wrote, what all these people missed is something Ehrlich's arch nemesis, University of Illinois professor Julian Simon, observed in his 1981 book, The Ultimate Resource. Besides food, water, fuel, and land, Simon argued that there is another resource Malthusians fail to take into account: human ingenuity. This awesome resource is one that increases with population and makes it impossible for us to know how far inventions can stretch or renew existing natural resources. Well, look around you, man. I think we're finding out how far we can stretch. We've stretched a little far, and our ecosystems are crumbling under the weight of human ingenuity and the sheer scale of the human enterprise. Pardon me, G. Shane Morris.
I feel like a lot of people with resources are like, if we can still take something out of the environment, it's okay. But I don't think they're thinking about there's only a point that the environment itself becomes sustainable and can fulfill and renew. It's like if you take a resource out, just because you can doesn't mean it will come back or you should. I think they're missing a point.
Yeah. Time and time again, people ignore the consequences of the Green Revolution, and they assume that we can do it again and again. And the fact is, we did it once. We were living on borrowed time, and the price we paid was really pretty dramatically high and negative. Later on, he writes, of course, there are other reasons not to be worried about overpopulation. Global population growth is slowing, and many experts predict it will level off or even reverse within a few decades. Well, actually, more than a few decades. I mean, they're predicting that it might level off in about 8 decades, and they're hoping for that. And if it levels off at 11 or 12 billion, it'll be leveling off at a very unsustainable level, when then we will not be able to feed that many people. We just won't, even if we have another green revolution. And if we do, that green revolution is bound to have such horrible unintended consequences that it'll just be an endless cycle of unintended consequences. He writes, I guess this is kind of intelligent. Are people a problem? Maybe so, but we're also the solution. That doesn't mean we need 12 billion of us. I'm sorry, I'm being a little ugly to this author, but this author was being a little ugly to Paul Ehrlich. And Paul Ehrlich, the fundamental messages that he has been advancing for decade after decade after decade are still true. And he's very knowledgeable and has done his research. And sorry, but I'm going to follow Paul Ehrlich, not any economist or any other growth booster, especially one that quotes Julian Simon. Julian Simon was... Sorry, he was off. He had it wrong. I promised you we'd talk a little bit about other films, and I will give you a link in the show notes to a GrowthBusters blog post from several years ago called Top 10 Population Films of All Time. If I were to write that today, I'd put a few different films on the list. But if you can go there, you'll find a few films listed like WALL-E, Logan's Run, ZPG. Did you know there was a film called ZPG, Dana?
No.
1972?
Yep, that's probably why I didn't know about it.
A really ugly film. I mean, that film did no favors to the cause of sustainable population advocacy, because it was another really ugly solution to overpopulation, and makes Avengers Infinity War, I don't know which one's worse. There's also a movie called Okja that came out in 2017. Have you heard of that?
I've heard of that, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't either.
It's not like pig farming or something?
These people come up with these super pigs as a solution to feeding.
Oh, yeah, they look kind of like pig hippos or something.
Yeah,
That's
they do. Yeah, it looks like kind of a sci-fi thing. But there's your Green Revolution number 2 in order to feed 12 billion people. This sci-fi movie's imagined solution is that they breed these super pigs, and I think the movie's about all the unintended consequences of having these huge pigs.
Super pigs. It just makes me laugh.
Yeah. And Wall-E, I think, was more about just our enormous amount of waste. Did you see that film?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's a Disney film. Of course, I've seen it.
Did you feel like it was about overpopulation or the...
I don't think it was about overpopulation as much. I think it was more about environmental degradation, because one of the most striking things about it was just how they portrayed Earth and how brown it was. You know, Wall-E was this brown machine in a brown Earth with all this trash, and then even when they went in their spaceship, all the satellites in the sky was even brown. And I think it's just a really pessimistic way, but then you're like, oh, it's a robot, it's so cute.
But definitely humans had to basically leave. We had to leave the Earth because we had screwed it up.
Yeah, it was interesting too, though, that I didn't think about it until just now, that it has like a thread of population topics in it, because, you know, they have to leave the Earth and they all go up into this huge cruise ship thing, and there's only a limited space on it, and it doesn't look like they have many kids either, so they reduce their population by a ton by doing that. So it's not a good way to do it, but it does happen, which is like in a funny way.
Yep. I mentioned Inferno earlier. That's a fairly current film that has this issue in it. Downsizing, we talked about in the last episode. I read that Ready Player One, I haven't seen that film. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't, but I've read about it. Steven Spielberg, I think, directed it. And it's this world that it's not that far from now, actually, I don't think. And everything is just built on top of each other, basically. And it's very overpopulated. And to solve that problem, instead of trying to actually solve it, they just escape into a video game, basically. So it's kind of an avoidance, like, okay, we've messed up the world. We're just going to kind of ignore it, I guess.
Yeah.
So interesting look.
Okay. Well, I think that wraps up our movie discussion, and we're over an hour. Do you want to do Lightening the Load, or shall we skip that this episode? Why don't we just skip it? Okay. Sorry about that if you were waiting for Lightening the Load. Well, you'll have to wait till next time. I promise we'll work that in the next episode of the GrowthBusters podcast. So
yeah, we'll think of some really good ones.
So thanks for listening. Don't forget to explore these issues at growthbusters.org. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your podcast app. Give us a review if you like what we're doing. Spread the word if you would like to live a decent life on a sustainable planet, if you'd like your children, the children of the world, and their grandchildren to at least have a chance at living decent lives, then help us spread the word and get this podcast into the ears of more and more people. We will do our best to raise important topics and enlighten people. We don't have all the answers. We have all the questions.
Oh, yeah. We definitely have the questions.
If you haven't seen the documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth, it's easy to find at growthbustersmovie.org or on Amazon. And we will talk to you in the next episode.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.